Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Joseph Hammer, and this is How to Apply to Psychology Graduate School. In this 2-hour webinar, I'm going to share everything I've learned about what it takes to successfully apply and get into psychology graduate school programs. If you are a student at the University of Kentucky interested in getting involved in a research lab to get research experience, come check out the Hammer Lab. You can learn more about us on my website, drjosephhammer.com. And we study what stops people from getting the mental health treatment that they need and how to measure things like self-esteem, spirituality, or stigma in a valid and reliable manner. Our agenda for this webinar, we have a lot to cover. We're going to start by talking about how to decide what type of graduate programs would be the right fit for you based on your interests and goals. I'm going to cover some of the typical graduate programs that students with bachelor's in psychologies tend to apply to for their next step. I'm going to talk about things you want to consider when comparing one program to another and trying to decide what will be the best option for you. And we'll talk about what does it look like to be a competitive applicant? What kind of GPA, GRE, what sort of attributes and research experience do you need to have? We'll also then lay out a timeline, a typical timeline that you may want to follow when it comes to applying for graduate school in a manner that's smart and is well managed and won't leave you rushing and stressed at the end. Then I will share advice for how to go about requesting letters of recommendation, because the way in which you do that can help get you a better or a worse letter, depending on your professionalism around that. Then I will give advice about how to write your personal statement, your curriculum vitae, and how to interview well. So my disclaimer is this is just my opinion. It's of course an informed opinion based on experience and research, but it is my opinion. You will hear other opinions from other people. So your job is to consider what I have to share and to approach other people and get information from them, and then read between the lines and come up with the truth that feels right for you based on your research. I want to mention something before we delve into this, that applying for graduate school is stressful. It is the equivalent of a 3-credit standalone course, in that there's a lot of work that goes into it, not only the fall of your senior year, but up until that point. And so as I talk, I guarantee that you're going to notice feelings of anxiety coming up and anxious thoughts popping up. And so that's okay. You're going to feel anxious. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't prevent it. What your job is to find a way to manage it in an adaptive and healthy way. So whether that's through critical thinking about those anxious thoughts, or mindfulness, or relaxation, or whatever it is that you need to be able to hold on to that anxiety gently and not let it stop you from doing what you need to do in this process, do that. Okay, so anxiety is a normal and healthy part of this process because it's important. It's about the next step in your life. So I recommend, when you're thinking about, okay, how am I going to go about applying to graduate school, I recommend working backwards. That's really important. So you start with, what kind of work activities do you want to do? So you have to figure out, what do I want to do on my day-to-day job? And then you figure out what sort of degree, what sort of profession, what sort of specialty will help train you so you become eligible to get a job doing that sort of thing. So you work backwards. So here are some things you're going to want to ask yourself. And it's a lot of questions. You don't have to answer it all at once, but this is something, especially if you're earlier on in your time here at UK, that you want to start asking and trying to answer over time. So first, what work activities do you want to do? There's a lot of things that you can do as a professional, as a mental health professional. So you can do research, which you're all familiar with what that is. You can do talk therapy, where you're working with individuals, groups, couples, or families, any or all of those. You can do assessment, which is basically using psychological tests to measure people's personality or their mental health difficulties or their neurological status, learning disabilities, things like that. Consultation, which is where you provide your expertise to organizations or groups or people to help them do things better. Outreach, which is where you're reaching out to community to let them know about mental health issues or advocate in terms of advocacy. That's when you're advocating for marginalized groups who do not have the necessary rights and privileges that they should have. Prevention, which is developing and administering programs in the community to help people build resilience and health to help prevent mental illness from ever occurring. Administration, which is being like a department chair or an administrator of a hospital or mental health agency where you're running the business. And then clinical supervision and training is clinical supervision is where you're providing supervision to other less experienced folks who are doing therapy, and you're giving them tips on how to do better talk therapy. Teaching and training. Teaching, you know what teaching is. You can teach undergrads or grad students. Training is where you're training grad students in how to do therapy assessment, things like that. What populations do you want to help? This is another thing. Are you primarily interested in working with undergraduate students, such as in a teaching and training environment? Do you want to do therapy with children or older adults? Do you want to work with particular marginalized populations? Would you prefer not to work with individuals, but mostly groups or organizations? So if you know these things about yourself, that also makes certain career paths a better or worse fit. With what issues? So if you're wanting to help with mental illness stuff specifically, or you want to work with folks who have depression, anxiety, substance abuse, difficulty with relationships and family issues, developmental and learning disorders, more serious mental illness, with figuring out what career is a good fit for them, helping businesses and organizations do hiring and promotion better. These are all different sort of topics, and some may be more or less interesting to you and would make certain occupations more or less of a good fit. Likewise, in what setting? So maybe you really prefer to be in a university academic department doing research and teaching, or working with young kids in K through 12, or a staff psychologist at a university counseling center, or working as a psychologist in a hospital or corrections, or in businesses. Again, you might have preferences around settings. So how do I figure out the answer to those questions? Because that's a lot of questions. So what you're supposed to be doing as you're going through your years of undergrad is you're taking courses, getting involved in research assistantships and internships and volunteering and doing internet research to get exposure to different types of work tasks. So you can figure out, ooh, I tried that out, I didn't like that at all. Or I tried this is really interesting to me. So by exposure to these things and trying them on for size, you start to form preferences for and against certain things. And ideally you'll have some preferences codified by the end of your third year. Okay, that's ideal. So, working backwards, once you know what kind of work activities you want to do, then you can figure out what kind of degree in which profession specialty you should pursue. Okay, that's the logic. So, overwhelming chart, but bear with me. Here are some typical options. It's not exhaustive. There are many other allied professions that people with bachelors in psychologies go into, such as physical therapy and human resources and speech pathology, etc. So this is not exhaustive, but for folks after your bachelor's, if you stay in psychology, then there's a variety of what we call specialties in psychology that you can go to graduate school to get a degree in one of these specialties. So at that top bubble there, counseling, clinical, and school, is where people learn to be talk therapists and do other things. And so those are different flavors of that. Developmental, educational, social and personality, neuro, behavioral, cognitive, these tend to be more research-focused jobs where you may not be doing talk therapy necessarily as a part of it. It tends to be more research-focused. And then you got industrial, organizational, forensic, and rehabilitation, which can have some research components, can have some applied components as well. And for certain of these fields, sometimes you can get a 2-year master's degree, sometimes you can get a 4 or 5-year doctoral degree, such as a PhD or a PsyD, which we'll talk about in a moment. But there's not just psych. There's marriage and family therapy, social work, counselor education / counseling, and medicine, nursing, and psychiatry. So these are other allied health fields that look at mental health, and a lot of practice talk therapy to some degree. And so you may find that, like with marriage and family therapy, like their name suggests, they focus on folks in relationships and family dynamics. So if that's really something really of interest to you, marriage and family therapy might be a good fit for you rather than psych. Social work does things from talk therapy, just like psychologists do, to things like case consultation, helping hook people up with resources and community services that they need to live more healthy, adaptive lives. Counselors is a big master's level profession where people learn to do talk therapy for mental health, academic, career stuff. A lot of degrees are offered in that field. And then medicine, nursing, and psychiatry it's more likely that you'll be involved in that medication and that heavy biological component as a part of any treatments you might be providing. And that can range from 2-year master's nursing degrees to multi-year MDs, medical doctor degrees, if you're going to be a psychiatrist, for example. So these are different paths, and it can be overwhelming to figure out, like, well, I know I want to help people, but I don't know which of these professions and which of these psych specialties might be the best fit. I developed a mental health professions career test that's on my website, drjosephhammer.com. If you go to it, you can complete a battery of items, and it will give you scores on how much 21 different occupations seem to match what's of interest to you in terms of work activities. It doesn't capture all the professions on this screen, but it captures 21 of them. So I highly recommend starting there if you want to get a sense of what professions or specialties might be a good fit and worth exploring more. In terms of a training path, you tend to see this training path across the different specialties and sometimes in the different professions, but it can get pretty complicated. So first we've got the bachelor's degree, and so after that some people can go straight into work without a license. So that's the non-licensed activities part. And so for that can be things like some substance abuse counselors can do work with just a bachelor's degree and no license. You can go into other forms of non-licensed counseling. It's possible to get a bachelor's with a heavy concentration in industrial organizational psychology, for example, and then go and work in a business setting, things like that. But in general, if you want to do talk therapy, that almost always means that you need to get at least a master's. So that's where that MS is down there. So you can go into an MS, and then depending on the degree program, you might be able to start practicing after that 2 or 3 year master's degree. And so different professions offer master's degrees, such as social work, marriage and family therapy, counseling, and psychology also offers master's degrees, though I'll have to say a little bit more about that later. If you go the doctoral route, there are 2 main flavors of doctoral level degree, at least when it comes to psychology. We've got the PhD and the PsyD, and I'll say a little bit more about the differences between those. For now, I'll say that with the PhD, it carves a path for you to be able to do talk therapy, assessment, consultation, advocacy, research, teaching, any of that stuff. It's a very flexible degree, and it takes about 6 years and has a heavy research component, typically. With the PsyD, it's more focused on therapy exclusively. It's not focused on producing scholarship. And so with the PsyD, you can do therapy, you can do assessment, but it's usually not the path people take if they want to do research or teaching. So if you really like research and teaching and want that to be a part of your future career, the PhD is probably going to be a better fit. Okay. I want to say something briefly about the difference between counseling psychology and clinical psychology, because folks often don't know what's the difference between the two. These are two specialties of psychology that have different historical roots, but these days they're more similar than different. And if you want to see a detailed breakdown of tendencies of what this field versus this field tends to focus on, that's on my website that you can find. The thing I want to emphasize is that you're going to find the biggest differences in terms of training and focus from one program to the next, regardless of whether it's a clinical or counseling program. So the inter-program differences within clinical or within counseling, that's where a lot of the difference is. So you really want to be intentional about looking at the specific attributes of a program. Okay? My overall recommended decision process, thinking about those path diagrams that you saw a few slides ago, I recommend thinking about what activities you like and then picking the profession and, if applicable, the specialty that focuses on those type of work activities and those types of settings and those type of issues. And then once you've picked the profession and specialty, then you want to go with a degree that will help you prepare to do the necessary work in that profession. So to become a psychologist, that requires a doctoral degree. That's just an aspect of the field. So in terms of picking the degree, like stopping at the bachelor's, just getting a master's or a master's and then a doc, or just going straight to the doc, these are all possible. If you want a doctorate, here's what I would say. If you want a doctorate, should you get a master's first? Here's my short answer. The master's can give you additional time to develop your skills and your experiences and your publications so that it becomes possible for you to be a more competitive applicant. So having a master's by itself will not make you more competitive for a doctorate program. It's the option of spending 2 more years developing your skills and becoming a stronger applicant. That is why a master's can be helpful for preparing you for doctorate education. Okay, so it depends. And then if you're thinking about counseling or clinical, should you get the PhD or the PsyD? That's another thing to consider. We'll talk about the differences between the two on the next slide. And then once you've picked your degree, then at that point you start to identify programs across the country that offer that specific degree in that specific profession and specialty. Okay, so don't start looking at programs until you can answer the first 2 questions. So for counseling or clinical folks, the PhD versus the PsyD, what's the difference? The PhD is built on what was called the Boulder Model, which was a conference where they said, here's how we want the PhD in psychology to be structured. And they came up with the label scientist practitioner, which means people trained for a PhD should be both scientists and practitioners. They need both skill sets, both science and therapy. Okay. For these types of programs, there's an 8% acceptance rate. So about 8% on average of people applying to a given program get in. So it's pretty rigorous, right? Now the cool thing about if you can get into a program like this, because they're so stringent with their requirements and take typically 4 to 8 people in a given cohort, that the vast majority of folks in PhD programs are funded. So they get their tuition waived, and they get $1,000, $1,500 a month stipend to help defray the costs of rent and things like that. So that's the cool thing about PhD programs, is that you don't go into as much debt. So the median debt for folks with a PhD is $50K. Whereas with the PsyD, it's based on the Vail model, a later conference, and this is on a practitioner scholar model, and it focuses on practice. So they want you to be able to read and digest scholarship. That's where the scholar part comes from, but you're not producing it. You're not contributing to the research domain usually. And so it's focused on just learning to do therapy really, really well. Their acceptance rate is much higher. They're much less stringent about who they take on. And the big downside of the PsyD is that very, very, very few PsyD students get funding, which is why the median debt is so high. After 4 to 5 years of the PsyD, the average the median debt is $180K. So that's big. And there are larger class sizes because they accept so many more people. One one distinction to make is between university-affiliated PsyDs and professional school PsyDs, standalone. So like Adler School of Psychology or Chicago School of Psychology or Alliant International. These are professional schools unaffiliated with a brick and mortar university. And what I want to say about the difference between these is usually with university affiliated PsyD programs, there can oftentimes be more support, smaller class sizes. There can be some benefits to that. Whereas with the professional schools, you really have to look closely at their faculty to student ratio and other things and the debt you're going to go into to make sure that's going to be a good fit. So you have to really be careful. Some things to think about. First of all, the length of time to degree. So when you're considering this program versus this program, or this field versus this field, think about the length of time it's going to take you to earn that degree. So master's degrees, 2 to 3 years. PhD or PsyDs, 4 to 6 years typically, sometimes more. And not only is there the time to degree, but for some of these professions, after you get your degree, you still have to do a year of additional supervised experience, like a postdoctoral year, for example, in order to become ready for licensure. So if you need to get licensed at the master or doctoral level, you have to accrue additional hours, jump through some hoops. You need to take a big exam called the EPPP, for example, if you want to become a psychologist. So there's some other stuff involved, and you want to know what extra stuff are you going to need to do in terms of licensure or credentialing or whatever after your degree, because that's additional time before you can start earning full potential or getting hired at certain places. Okay, so that's an important thing to mention. With earnings potential and market demand, you obviously want to go into a profession and specialty where they need people like that, right? So make sure you can look on ONET, which is a government database, just Google ONET, and you can look at the growth for that particular specialty or profession. So you want to make sure you're going to be in demand if you go into that field. And likewise, you want to look at the earnings potential for that. So what can you reasonably expect to make? And ONET breaks it down by state. So if you know where you're going to live, you can break down average salary by state, which is really helpful because you need to know how much you're going to earn when you consider the cost. So what are you going to be paying in tuition? Are you going to be able to get that waived? Or are you going to have to pay out of pocket? Fees? Are you going to be taking out loans for this? And what I mean by earnings loss is that the time you spend in school is time you spend not out in the working world earning money and building your nest egg, right? So I was in grad school for 8 years. So that was 8 years where I was primarily net negative or even on income, right? So it was 8 years of not earning an income. And that can make a difference to folks. You got to think about, is that sustainable for you? And so you got to think about earnings potential versus cost. Can I pay off my debt in a reasonable amount of time? Is there a way that I can do a loan repayment program through the government where I provide services in an underserved area and because of that they wipe out some of my debt? That can be a really cool thing. Okay, aptitude, etc. When you're thinking about a given profession, you want to know what are the criteria for getting into programs in that area, because some of them have really stringent requirements, some of them have less stringent. So think about your own natural talents and whether you're going to be a good talk therapist or a good researcher or a good teacher. Do you think you have the raw talent to do that? You also got to think about your skills. So what can you do now, and what do you feel like you can learn? Because for most of you, you're going to go to school or training to develop those skills. So you want to make sure you have the aptitude, the capacity to develop a given skill set. And in order to get into programs, you have to have a certain basic foundational level of skills. To get into a PhD, you have to have some experience with the research process as an RA, and preferably doing an independent project or a senior thesis or something. So do you have the skills at the point you're starting to apply to be competitive to get into programs? So that is an important thing to think about. With work ethic, graduate school is tough. You'll oftentimes be putting in 60-hour work weeks. And so with the passion part, you really got to love what you're doing. You really got to love the field in this work and have a strong work ethic so that you don't burn out. Because if you don't have that strong work ethic, you will burn out after a year or two of this intense training. And that's just something you need to be honest with yourself about. Okay, in terms of, I want to mention that average salary for working with just a bachelor's in mental health is 20 to 30K. With a master's, it's typically 30 to 50K. And with a PhD, it's typically 60 to 80K. So when thinking about how long it takes you to do that degree, and etc., earnings typically do go up the heavier your training, though there are variables that make it depend. The last thing to think about, or one of the other things to think about, is program competitiveness. So here's a chart of the percentage of applicants accepted into different types of psychology programs. And you can see that the average is around that 10 to 12% overall for these fields. With clinical psych, for example, it's 8 or 9%. So it's very tough to get into a doc program, okay? And so you have to be a really competitive applicant. With master's programs, it's much more favorable. So about half of applicants get into a master's program. So any one of you, I think, with reasonable experience can get into a master's program, especially if you apply to several. And this is why a lot of times people are not a part of that 10% and need more time by going into a master's program so that they can get those necessary qualifications to get into the competitive doctoral programs. So that's a reality to keep in mind. It's competitive. Something else to think about. When you're considering a profession and when you're starting to compare programs, you need to make sure that you go to a program that's accredited. So institutions are accredited regionally, and then specific programs are accredited within each profession. So the American Psychological Association accredits psychology doctoral programs. They don't accredit master's programs, which we'll talk about in a bit. They just accredit doctoral programs. So if you want to get a doctorate in psych, you want to go to an APA accredited program. If you want to become a counselor at the master's level, your program should be accredited by KCREP or MCAC. And you want to do some more research into that, because there's some folks who say you really want to go to a KCREP program to maximize your employability, though the political sands are always shifting around that. So you need to do your homework around that. With social workers, the CSWE accredits programs in social work, so you want to go to an accredited program. And the marriage and family therapists at the master's level is also accredited. So you want to keep that in mind. Go to an accredited program. Otherwise, you might not be able to get a job because they won't consider your degree legitimate. Okay? Serious business. Licensure at the state level. So psychologists and psychological associates, these are two different levels of licensure, and licensure depends on the state. So the board examiners in psychology is the board that regulates psychology in this state. And they license people as doctoral psychologists and then as master's level psychological associates. Psychological associates can do certain things, but not other things at the master's level. They typically require supervision around certain tasks for at least 5 years, etc. Psychological associates is a thing that only exists in a handful of states, Kentucky being one of them. So in a lot of other states, there will be no licensure for psychology folks at the master's level. You gotta go get your doctorate in order to be licensed in psychology. In Kentucky and in most other states, you've got licensed clinical social workers, licensed professional clinical counselors, and licensed marriage and family therapists. So if you go into any one of those professions, you will get licensed under that profession. I want to mention a brief note here about psychology and counseling. So historically, folks who have done a master's in clinical psychology or master's in counseling psychology have been able to go to the board of professional counselors in their state and say, hey, I've got trained in counseling psych or clinical psych. I feel like I have the similar competencies as do master's level counselors from counselor or counselor ed programs. Can I get licensed as a licensed professional clinical counselor with this master's in psych? In a lot of states, the answer is still yes. In some states, the boards of professional counselors are starting to say, no, I don't think your training in counseling or clinical psychology has made you eligible to be a licensed professional clinical counselor. And that is, for example, the case in Kentucky. So our LPCC board will not let masters in counseling or clinical folks become LPCCs and practice at the master's level in that capacity. So that's something you need to know. Can I get a master, if you're going to go the psychology route, and you're hoping to get licensed at the master's level as a clinical counselor, you have to know whether your master's in counseling psych or master's in clinical psych will be eligible, whether that board will accept that training. And so that's something in flux right now across the country, and you're going to really have to do your homework and make sure that in that state you'll be able to get the licensure that you want with the degree that you pursued. So that's a very important thing to mention. Something to mention about licensure for psychologists. I mentioned you have to do usually postdoctoral hours to accrue additional experience before you become eligible to get licensed. You'll need to take the EPPP, the big psychology exam, which took me 125 hours to study for. It was a big pain. You'll probably need to take a state-based ethics and clinical oral exam as a part of getting licensed in that state, and then you'll need to earn continuing education credits every few years to maintain your license. So there's more to it than just getting your PhD. Okay. Other things to think about. So much to think about. It's overwhelming, right? Online-only programs. They've exploded recently because people love the convenience of, getting your degree in your underwear at home. And for that, you really have to be careful about the quality of these programs. Are they accredited by the APA or KCREP? You want to be sure that this program is accredited at the program level, not at the institutional level, but at the program level by the respective agency in that profession. Otherwise, you might not be able to get a job. And you want to figure out, are folks who are doing this online program getting employed? Are they getting jobs? Can that online-only program provide evidence of that that's the case? Because the thing is, with online programs, you don't get typically that personal touch from faculty, that one-on-one mentoring, and that in vivo practice with somebody that most of us consider essential for learning to do therapy, for example. So online-only programs is not something I recommend to any of the students that I work with. It may be a good fit for some people. I don't know. Just be extremely careful and skeptical about online-only programs. So that's my caveat related to that. School psych and industrial organizational psych are these interesting special cases where school psych you can get certified at the master's level, but you could also get a doctorate to then get licensed as a psychologist. With industrial organizational, the typical, when we say terminal degree, that means like the typical ending highest degree. Like people tend to not go beyond this. So for both school and industrial, they tend to stop at master's. But with industrial, you can go on to get a doctorate, and some people with their doctorate in IO may or may not be licensed. It depends on what kind of services you want to do and what the regulations are in that state. And then I want to emphasize that psychiatrists, what's psychiatry and psychiatrists? They're medical physicians. Okay, they're MDs who can prescribe meds. Usually psychologists are not allowed to prescribe meds. They can in a few states, and we might see more of that, but generally psychologists are doing talk therapy. They're not doing medicinal biological therapies in that way. So psychiatrists are different than psychologists. Psychiatrists are medical doctors, and they get trained as medical doctors, and they go to medical school. Okay, common misconception. So, if you want the master's or the PsyD, and we'll talk about the PhD on the next slide. If you want a master's or a PsyD and you determine that's a good fit for you, how do I know what programs to look at? Your primary focus is going to be finding programs that match your career goals, that have a training environment that's going to prepare you with the skills and competencies and credentials to be able to do those type of mental health activities that you wanted to do. So it's about the program's overall training of you, okay? Not about specific people at that program. So that's the case for Master's in PsyD. For PhD, for most PhD programs, specifically for PhD programs where you're going to be working under a mentor, a major professor. It works on apprenticeship model. Most PhDs are like this, where when you go to a PhD program, you're supposed to be working under a specific professor with their research, and you're going to be developing your own program of research probably related to what they do. So because the PhD has that research component, remember scientist, practitioner with the scientist? Because you have to work under a given person, you have to make sure you're applying to programs where you can work with a professor who shares the same research interests as you do, the same general area of research. And the more kind of narrowed down your research interests are, the easier it is to pick a few professors who match that. So you want to balance between too broad of research interests, like I'm interested in culture and multiculturalism. That might be a little too broad. It might be, you might want to narrow it down to like health and disparities research with African American and Latino men, for example. That's a little bit more narrow. You might be able to find professors, a reasonable list of professors at programs that you could apply to who fit that research area. And of course, when you're looking for PhDs and trying to find professors you could work with and what programs they're in, if you're going to go to work with that professor, make sure the program is going to get you the skills that you want. So as an example, when I was applying, I was considering both counseling psych, clinical psych, and social psych programs, because I was interested in doing psychology of men and masculinity stuff, for example, study of gender. And there were professors in programs where I'd be scientist practitioners, and then there were professors who were in programs where it would just be research, so like a social psychology degree. And so I knew that I wanted to have both the scientist and the practitioner, so I went towards the counseling and clinical programs, not the social programs. If I didn't want anything to do with talk therapy, I probably would have been much more interested in the social psych program, where I just would have been doing research and getting some teaching experience and such. So make sure the program training model fits your goals, obviously. So when it comes to comparing programs, we've got some key information sources. 2 books I really like, APA Graduate Study in Psychology and The Insider's Guide. Those are the 2 books that I recommend getting a used copy of from Amazon and reading, because they are a great one-stop shop resource for, okay, how do I find the right program for me and other stuff. And then of course, do a lot of internet research. The different specialties have their own websites, so like Counseling Psych is Division 17 of APA. Their website has a lot of great info about counseling psych and has a list of all the accredited programs, etc. So you're going to need to use those information resources to educate yourself on different programs in your chosen specialty. You also want to compare programs on their admissions criteria. So that APA Graduate Study in Psychology book, for example, lists the requirements in terms of typical minimums and preferred minimums for GPA, GRE scores, etc. So you think, okay, where am I at when I'm applying my fall of senior year, and what are my credentials, how good are my numbers? And so what programs am I going to be a competitive applicant for, and which ones do I not have a chance? So if you have a 3.2 GPA, you're probably not going to have luck applying to a program that says their absolute minimum GPA is 3.5. Right? So you can help narrow down programs about what's a realistic fit for you based on your numbers. And it's important to mention that GPA and GRE work on a threshold model, where as long as you're kind of above that comfortable or preferred minimum, whether you're at a 3.6 or a 3.8 might not end up making the difference. As long as you're above that minimum cutoff, then they tend to look at other aspects like your research experience and your letters. And that's what ends up making the final decision. So you just got to get above those minimums, but don't fret about 3.7 versus 3.8. It's not worth your time. Obviously, get good numbers, but once you're above those minimums, it's good enough. When you're comparing programs, think about their internship match rate. And so for clinical and counseling programs at least, and probably some other programs, at the end of your PhD, you have to spend a year being a staff psychologist at an agency somewhere, doing therapy for a year, basically, in this practice environment. And that's called an internship, the pre-doctoral internship. And there is a national match, kind of like they have in medicine, where everybody says, I'm applying to all these places, and all these places, like, we're interested in these applicants, and there's this big numerical algorithm that places people with sites. And once they've done that, then people get placed at certain places. And not everybody matches, so there are more applicants than there are places. So it gets people anxious and a little competitive. So you want to see, what is this program's internship match rate? you want to see at least 75% or more, preferably much higher, matching. So you want to make sure that if I go to this program, I have a really good chance of getting that required pre-doctoral internship, getting matched the first time I apply, because you don't want to have to delay your program a year. And if you don't get an internship, you can't graduate with your degree. So it's real serious business. Other rates to be interested in, and what's their EPPP pass rate if they provide that. So if they prepare people who go on to seek licensure, the psychologists, for example, this is only relevant to psychology, by the way. If they go on to that, what percentage of people pass the EPPP? Because obviously that means that the program better prepared them if they have a higher pass rate. Likewise, if it's really important to you to get licensed, if you want to practice therapy and you want to get licensed, you want to go to a program where a big chunk of their students go on to get licensed, because it's a sign that that pathway works. They train them well to be eligible for licensure. And then you also want to know about attrition rates. So what percentage of people who enter the program at year 1 graduate versus drop out? Because if a lot of people are dropping out, that's a bad sign that maybe that program is not a healthy environment for folks, or they have trouble retaining people because they don't have enough resources, or the interpersonal environment isn't good. Whatever it is, you want to see a very high retention rate and a very low attrition rate. Okay. Percentage of students funded. So this is a whole big thing, funding for programs. So what percentage of their students are funded, and to what degree? What percentage of students get a tuition waiver? It's really important for keeping expenses down. What percentage of them get a stipend, a monthly stipend on top of that tuition waiver? And usually you get the tuition waiver and stipend by doing a 10 or 20 hour a week graduate assistantship, a research assistantship, a clinical assistantship, a teaching assistantship, RAGATA for those terms. By giving 20 hours of your time, your tuition gets waived and you get a small monthly stipend. So what percentage of their students have that? And for how many years? Is it just for the first year, or do they have that funding for all of their years? Is that funding guaranteed? So before you say yes to the acceptance letter, if you're offered admission, do they guarantee that funding? Because that's obviously nice if they do. And then the tuition is, does that GA-ship, does that funding come with a tuition waiver? Because if it's just the monthly stipend, but not the tuition waiver, tuition can be really expensive, especially if you're an out-of-state student. So figure out the funding situation. As far as the cost of living in that city versus your GA stipend, some cities are really expensive and some are really good cost of living. So think about your monthly stipend and how much you can support yourself and defray rent costs and food costs and stuff like that. So in some cities, it's really cheap to be, and you can get by a lot farther on that $1,000 or $1,500 a month stipend. Some cities, that's not going to even be a third of your rent. So something to think about. Other things, the student to faculty ratio is really important. So the fewer the fewer students per faculty member means you're more likely to get personal attention. So in PhD programs, usually it's a really favorable ratio, whereas in PsyD programs, for example, the student to faculty ratio tends to be much bigger. There's a ton of students, and so it's harder to get face-to-face time and personalized attention, which can be really important if you're learning to do therapy skills. And research skills in particular, you need that mentoring. Student conference travel support, so do they provide funding and how much and how often to students? Because if research is a part of your thing, you need to go to conferences to present that research. You need some funding help. Typically it's like $200 or $300 a year that you can get help to help defray the costs of those plane tickets, that hotel stay, that sort of stuff. So is there conference travel money available? Do they provide close mentoring there? And that's related to the student-faculty ratio. Because close mentoring equals better success for you. Diversity of faculty and students. If being in a department, being in a program where there are folks who share your cultural identity and are a diverse set of individuals, if that feels important to you, you want to go to a program where you will be a part of that more diverse group and feel at home in that department rather than being in a very homogenous department. So that's something to think about if that's important to you and how diverse the programs are. And then geographic area perks. For some people, they really feel compelled to be in a big city or prefer more rural areas or whatever it is. So think about, of course, where that program is located. Where's that institution at? And is living in that town for 2 years or for 6 years going to be okay for you? If you're going to want to be dating folks and looking for relationships, are you going to be able to do that in that town? You know, these are some the life side of things that you need to think about. Another question is, where do they get jobs? So if you want to go to work at a hospital or to a university counseling center, or you want to be a professor at a research university, you want to see that this program's graduates are now working in settings like that, right? That's very important, because if nobody's going into hospitals after they graduate, are you going to be able to, or are you going to get the type of training that's going to help you do that? I'm not sure. If you're going the academic route, you also want to look at the specific mentor, the major professor you would be working with if you're going for the PhD. So if you're going the academic route and you're thinking about, and you want to do help-seeking research, and you're thinking about me, Dr. Hammer, and David Vogel at Iowa State University, and other people you might work with, look at that person and see who their advisees have been. Have they graduated advisees? Have they mentored people? Are those advisees of theirs now in faculty jobs? Were they able to get faculty jobs? Were they able to publish a lot with the help of their faculty member, major professor? You want to look at that, because if a professor has produced a lot of future scholars who are now in academic jobs, then that's a sign that if you worked with that professor, they could help you do that as well. So if you're going to go the academic route, look at the specific faculty member you would be working with. Okay, that's one thing too. Moving right along. What makes for a strong PhD applicant? So these are optimal kind of strong PhD applicants. You don't have to have all of this. This is something to strive for, but there's plenty of people who get into PhD programs and other types of programs who have less strong attributes in these ways. So this is something to kind of use as a ruler and a yardstick to aspire towards. So GPA above 3.5 ideally, 3.2 seems like a comfortable absolute minimum. GREs above those things there. Again, there can be some flexibility. Usually if your verbal and quant together is at least 300, you can get into certain programs. But those are some comfortable minimums. If you are going into a program where they have that therapy component, so like counseling, clinical, or school, so not necessarily like social or IO or cognitive or whatever. If you're going into a specialty of psych where you're going to have to learn to do talk therapy, another thing that they're going to want to see is they're going to want to see evidence on your curriculum vitae that you've had experience with helping skills, basic active listening skills, those sorts of things. So you need to be able to demonstrate that you've practiced those helping skills in some way, in some supervised setting. There are resources on my website and on APA's How to Apply to Graduate School website that give advice on, okay, what sort of agencies can I work at, what sort of internships can I do to help develop those basic skills, start to learn and practice those basic helping skills so that I can list that on my CV and find a letter of rec writer who can speak to those skills. Okay. In terms of RA-ship, if you're trying to go into a program where they have a strong research component, then I recommend being an RA in at least 2 labs by the time you're applying, and at least spending 2 semesters in one of those labs, so you can demonstrate some longevity and hopefully get to take on some more advanced tasks. And I have a video on my website, on my YouTube channel, about how to pick the right research lab that I strongly recommend. It was a presentation I did to PsyChi last year, and it gives advice on how to pick a good research lab that will help facilitate your own career goals. with that advanced tasks piece, that's speaking to, you're going to start out with basic tasks when you're a new RA, but you ideally want to graduate to more complex tasks and projects on behalf of that professor or that research lab, because we're looking for talent in our prospective PhD students, and that means that students have had some practice taking on some more advanced tasks, like doing a literature review or writing a small section of a paper for publication, or being an author on a poster, things like that. You want to get involved in those advanced tasks during your time in the research labs. What's a nice feather in your cap is if you can do a senior thesis or independent research project, or if you're an author on a poster, or even a paper, a manuscript, if you can manage that. So these are more advanced things that require more autonomy and more initiative on your part to see through. We like to see those because that's exactly the sort of thing you're going to be doing when you're a bona fide graduate student, is you're going to be taking the lead on some things. You're going to be driving the bus, and your advisor is going to be helping shape the path and support you in that quest. But they're not going to be dragging you along. You must be self-sufficient. So we'd like to see a senior thesis, independent research project, authorship, because it shows that you have that capacity for some autonomy. Okay. You're going to need 3 letters of rec for most of these programs you want to apply to. Sometimes, especially for master's programs, it might only be 2 letters, but typically it's 3. So from the very start of your undergrad, ideally you are thinking about, who can I get to write me a letter? What sort of experiences can I get so that I can have 3 letter writers ready to write strong letters of recommendation? Okay. And typically, if you're applying to a PhD program that focuses just on research, then you want at least 2 of your letters to be from the professor of those research labs, who can speak to your research skills and your academic and publication capacities. If you're applying to a PhD where it has both that clinical practice component and the research component, you want one of your letters to be from the supervisor who witnessed those helping skills in action when you were doing that internship or working at that agency or whatever. People who can speak to your empathy, your compassion, your communication ability, your ability to connect and empathize and be supportive. So you're going to want a letter from that. And ideally, if you did a senior thesis or independent research project or whatever, you can have someone who's seen you in that, working in that autonomous capacity, and can speak to and vouch for your ability to take the lead on things. So that's generally what I recommend for your 3 letters of rec. I go into more detail about this, by the way, at that page that you can see at the bottom of the slide there. I go into more detail about each of these attributes of what I consider to be a strong applicant. And again, reminds you all, this is just my opinion about what makes for a strong applicant. Lastly, awareness. You can be a really strong, promising graduate student with really good smarts, but if you make people not like you by how you behave and talk and communicate and dress and your nonverbals and stuff like that, it can make people not want to bring you onto the program, because they're going to have to work with you for 2 or 6 years, and they want to like you as a person, right? They want to feel comfortable around you. So you need to be aware of how you come across to people interpersonally and be mindful of that and work on yourself if you need to. Some programs, but not all programs. So like in counseling psych, speaking for my specialty, cultural and emotional awareness, also very important. May not be the case in some other specialties. Knowing yourself as a cultural being, your own racial identity, sexual orientation, gender, etc. These parts of yourself you want to know a little bit about. What does it mean? How do these parts of your identity influence your life? How you've been socialized, how people treat you, how you think about the world. You want to have a basic core understanding of that, preferably an idea about what these things we call like power, privilege, and marginalization are, these forces that exist and influence people's lives and can build people up or knock them down, knowledge of these things. And around culture, what's most important is an openness and a desire to learn and grow in one's awareness. So we don't expect you to be an expert in terms of cultural awareness. We mostly are most We want you to have a foundational understanding that we can build from, but we want you to be open to growing into that more. That's the most important thing, is the openness to growth. And with the emotional piece, if you're going to be a talk therapist, you got to be empathetic. You have to be somewhat in tune with your own emotional experience if you're going to help somebody else manage theirs, right? And so that will also show up in interpersonally how you are. Can you relate warmly and empathetically to someone? Are you relatable? So that emotional self-awareness is an important piece. Okay, I am parched, so I'm gonna take a second to drink some water. Okay, I'm back. So one of the things, I saw this cool graphic from this 2016 report from APA that highlights what stuff is more or less important for certain programs. And for research programs, so for PhD programs, you can see that the importance of research, which is that upper right-hand bubble, the farther out the lines are towards the outer edge is the more important it is. So that blue line there is for programs in university arts and sciences, which tended to be PhD programs. They rated research much more highly than the folks in the gray and green lines, which are for the professional schools, either freestanding or university-based. So those professional schools that tend to be PsyD programs, you can see that research is much less important to PsyD programs, which would make sense. And that's why a lot of students who don't like research or don't have any research experience but want to go on and become a psychologist will opt for the PsyD, because the research requirements are less stringent in terms of admissions criteria. And then likewise, the flip side for work and clinical practice, for those PsyD programs, those freestanding programs, they tend to really weigh most heavily your work practical experience and your clinical experience, that helping skills stuff that you have so far. They tend to look for evidence of that more so than the PhD programs. And then that last red bubble towards the bottom shows that your career goals, the clarity of them, the match of them, your interviewing expertise, how good your interview was, the strength of your letters of rec, and the strength of your GPA, all considered very important by everybody. So kind of universally that stuff people care about, so thought I would share that. Okay, now the application timeline. So from year one, so even before you get to your year of applying, which usually is, if you're on a 4-year plan, it's usually your 4th year, your senior year. If you're taking more time, obviously it will be your final year in the fall when really starts kicking. But before that, from year one up until that year you apply, you're going to be taking rigorous coursework, not just courses you can get easy A's in, because professors like myself will look at what courses you've taken, and we'll look to see if you've taken the good rigorous stats courses and the good core courses and research methods and the lab course and stuff like that. We want to see that because it means you challenged yourself and got exposure to developing good skills that will set you up well for doing research and practice. Did you get so rigorous coursework and then getting research and applied experience? Research experience is starting off as an RA and then hopefully graduating into independent projects with the help of a professor. Applied experience is that clinical practice, so working in agencies where you can demonstrate those helping skills and get exposure to that. You're building relationships with 3+ letter writers, so a few people from research labs and a person from that applied experience agency where you were at, or something thereabouts. So you got to think about from the start who's going to write your letters. I see too many students who it's the fall that they're supposed to apply and they're like, oh, like I didn't really build any relationships with anybody. Nobody really likes me that much. Who am I going to get to write a letter? And this can oftentimes be the biggest barrier to being able to get into graduate school, because not only do you need a letter, but you need a strong letter, which we'll talk about later. So you want to be intentional about cultivating relationships with the professors in charge of your research labs that you're in, at the agency you're at. You want to impress them and do well so that you can eventually request letters from them, and that they'll be very happy to write them for you. Super, super important. You have to absolutely start preparing those letter building relationships before your senior year. Absolutely. Also, you're developing your research and applied interests. So you remember those questions I asked at the way start of this presentation. Do you like this? Do you hate this? What's going on? In order to have preferences, you got to get exposed to things. So you got to get involved in research labs. You got to go do applied experiences and volunteer and internships and that stuff so that you can form preferences, so that you know what type of career you want, so that you can figure out what type of graduate programs to apply to, right? And so other stuff, identify specialties and required degree, that flows from developing research and applied interests. And so in your junior year, ideally, you're starting to have some more concrete thoughts about what professions, what specialties might be a good fit for those research and applied interests you have. And then subsequently, what sort of degree in this profession or specialty is going to be a good fit for you? Do you only need to get a master's from counseling because you want to do talk therapy but only want to do 2 years of program of education? Or do you know you want to maybe do research and teaching, so you know you need to get a PhD, and you know you like the talk therapy side, so probably clinical or counseling, maybe school if you like working with kids in the talk therapy side and the assessment side. You know, you have to start thinking about these things. You can't start thinking about this your senior year, otherwise it's going to be too much to process. And then you need to have a backup plan. So if you're going to go for a doctoral level degree and you're hoping to be one of that 10% that gets accepted into a given program, you need to have a backup plan in case things don't go well. Typically what that looks like for folks is if they want to just go for the master's, they can usually do that, you know, because if you apply to several programs, you got a 50% chance of getting in. Usually you can make that happen, especially if you're willing to go to another geographic location somewhere in the US and can apply broadly. But if you want to go for a doctorate, especially a PhD, which tends to be harder to get into than a PsyD, you need to have a backup plan, because it's very possible you won't your first time around. And usually what that looks like is people will apply for PhD programs, and depending on how things are shaking out, they may then also apply for some master's programs, which I'll talk about the timing of that on the next slide. So apply for PhDs and also some backup master's programs so that you can do the master's, have more time to make yourself a more competitive applicant, after which those 2 or 3 years of master's work, hopefully then you can go into the PhD. So that's a typical backup plan. Or a backup plan may be applying for jobs out in the community that for which your bachelor's in psych could be useful for. Okay, need a backup plan. So that's stuff you're doing years 1 through 3 and into year 4. The summer before your 4th year, your senior year, you want to identify 8 to 12 programs in that specific profession and specialty and at that degree level that fits your future interests and goals. Okay, and I say 8 to 12 if you're going for a PhD, or it can be probably like 5 to 8 if you're going for PsyD, and it can probably be like 4 to 6 if you're going for masters. Again, just based on the competitiveness. So for the more competitive types of programs, if you're vying for those, you got to apply for more, because you have to let statistics work in your favor so that you can get in at least some places and then proceed with your career. Do you email faculty? That's a big question that is asked about a lot, and there's a lot of conflicting opinions. So once you've identified those programs, if you're applying to a PhD, this is mostly specific to PhDs because of that mentorship model where you'd work under somebody in that program, and that's the whole reason you're applying there, is because they match your research interests, right? So do you email them in advance of submitting an application? That hyperlink there, if you click on it or you go to my website, I did a whole video on do I email professors and how do I do it. And the simple answer is there's no one clear answer, but you want to email them if that's what they seem to request, or you have genuine questions that can't be answered by other information sources such as their web page or the program website, because you don't want to ask a question that you could get answered through an internet search. That's a big no-no. So there's advice on that on my website if you want it. You got to take the GRE. I definitely recommend taking the GRE the summer before, not the fall, or at least because you may want to take it again and you won't have time if you're starting to do that in September or October. You know, it gets too scrunched. I see people who didn't take the GRE in time, and that stops them from applying just because they didn't plan out in advance when they would take it. And of course, if you're going to take the GRE in July, you want to give yourself at least 2 months to study for the GRE. That's generally my recommendation. You may have to take the GRE psychology subject test. It totally depends on what types of programs you're applying to. Usually only certain types of PhD programs require this. Very uncommon at master's level. So based on the types of programs you're applying to, look at that graduate studying psychology book or look on their program websites and find out if they want you to take the GRE psychology subject test. And is it recommended? And how strongly is it recommended? Or it's recommended but not required? That can vary, you know, because you want to spend another 30 hours spending for the GRE psychology subject test if you're going to take it. So again, in the summer you got to be scheduling that. And then as you're identifying those 8 to 12 programs, you're creating a program Excel spreadsheet. So take out boot up your copy of Microsoft Excel, and you're creating a table of the different programs you're applying to, and you're filling out the table with key information. What's the name of the program? Where's the geographic location of the program? When is their due date? What type of materials do they need to be submitted? How are they submitted? Online or mail? How many letters of rec do they need? What's the program focus? Etc., etc. You need this to keep yourself organized. Otherwise, you're going to forget due dates and programs. It's going to be crazy. You want a good, organized, central program Excel spreadsheet. And if you Google, there's some nice examples online, and I'd be happy to provide one to you if you requested that of me. So this is what you do in summer before year 4. Year 4, September, October. So when you're applying in September or October, do a draft of your personal statement. And if you haven't created a CV, create it. Or hopefully for most of you, it's just updating your CV. So you create drafts of these, and then you get feedback from graduate students, from professors, whoever you can, both on content and style. And September, October is when you want to approach letter writers regarding your request to ask for letters of rec, which we'll talk about in a bit. You're going to want to approach them 6 weeks in advance of when their letter would be due to the program. We'll say more about that. And you're going to provide a packet to them. We'll say more about that in a second. You also want to get a copy of your transcript and make sure it looks okay and doesn't have F's or drops or other things that it shouldn't, because you got to get that cleaned up before you start sending transcripts out to all these programs, right? So you got to look for errors. November, December, crunch time. For PhD programs and PsyD programs, a lot of times your due dates maybe as early as November, a lot of times in December, and maybe some in January. For master's programs, it tends to be January through March or April, typically. So you can oftentimes see how your PhD stuff goes before deciding whether to submit master's applications, which is nice. You're submitting applications in November and December, and that has a number of components, usually a personal statement or a letter of intent. There's different words for it, but it's the essay you write about yourself and your goals. And then your CV, which is the laundry list of stuff you've done. It's different than a resume, which is a more abbreviated thing. Plenty of good CV resources online if you Google. They'll need a copy of your official transcript usually, which you have to have the institution usually directly mail to the program or pick up a copy of to include in your materials. You need to make arrangements to have your GRE scores sent from the GRE agency directly to the programs. Usually you can't just pass along the copy you got to them. They won't accept that. It's got to be official. There's usually a $50 to $100 application fee. So if you're applying to 10 to 12 programs that are $50 to $100 a pop, that can be $1,000 worth of program fees. So you got to save your money for that. You also got to set aside more money and time in December, January, February, sometimes even March, to fly or drive to interviews, because most programs, at least PhD programs, require an on-site interview. And usually they don't comp you for that, for the expenses. So you're going to have to be purchasing plane tickets and paying for gas and taking time out of class and other things to be able to get to these interviews. Okay. Year 4, January, March. So submit master's applications. So if it's a part of your plan, this is when you would do it. If doctoral stuff, if you didn't get a lot of interviews or interviews are not going so well, then it might point towards, okay, if I want to kind of have a shot at the PhD in the future, or this ID in the future, I might need to do a master's program first, so you may want to start submitting those master's applications. So unless you're a super strong applicant, have in mind some master's programs that you'd be interested in and be thinking about whether you may want to be applying to them or not. And one cool thing is, at least for counseling and clinical programs, I don't know if this is the case for others, but a lot of times if you apply to a PhD program, and your numbers are okay, but you don't quite make the cut, whether at the submission application stage or after the interview, sometimes you'll be offered admission or the chance to apply to their master's program. So you can still go to that institution and maybe interact with some of those faculty, but you'd be doing their terminal master's program, which might be a step ladder into their PhD possibly, or a PhD somewhere else. So sometimes that happens. Sometimes you'll be offered admission to the master's program. I know our counseling psych PhD program will offer admission to some applicants who are not quite ready for the PhD or not quite a good fit that given year, but we'd love to see them come to our master's program. So that's the timeline. Let's talk about requesting letters of rec. At least 6 weeks in advance. The shameful absolute minimum is 2, so don't even dare approaching some professor or whatnot about a letter if they'd have less than 2 weeks to write it. It will be experienced as insulting of their time and schedules. And if you're approaching them at a minimum of 2 weeks, there's still some shame in that. They're gonna not be very pleased that you're asking such a quick turnaround time. So absolute minimum of 2, but the respectable minimum is like 4 or 6 weeks. So sometimes life isn't perfect and you have to hold your hat in your hands and and feel a little embarrassed and ask. Sometimes that's happening, but you want to avoid it if you can, especially since they may even talk about your time management skills in their letter and talk about your attributes. And so if you're asking them late, it's not sending a great impression, right? That's not what you want to be doing to the person who's supposed to speak to your quality as a person and professional. Ideally, you're getting letters from doctoral degree holders. If you're applying to doctoral level degrees, you want letters from people who have actually done a doctoral level degree and succeeded, because they're the ones who know what it takes. Excuse me. Sip of water. They're the ones who knows what it takes to succeed and graduate in graduate school. Whereas someone with a master's or just a bachelor's may not be familiar with that doctoral level environment, and their letter may carry less weight. So a lot of times with your research lab experiences, your letter writer can be the professor, the person with the PhD. Sometimes if you were working closely with a graduate student or a lab coordinator or something, they may write the letter and the professor of the lab will sign off on it. That's not uncommon. Can be just fine. If the letter's from a graduate student rather than the professor, that's less good. You want to try and avoid that if you can, but if it's all you can do, it's all you can do. If you're applying to a program that has that clinical practice applied component as well as the research component, and you want that letter from that supervisor at that agency, a lot of times that person is going to only have a bachelor's or a master's, and there's not much you can do about that, unfortunately. And so that letter from that helping skills experience supervisor may not have the PhD, and that's okay. People will understand, because a lot of times at a lot of agencies they don't have a doctoral level person who was familiar with that helping skills work you were doing. So it's great if they happen to have a PhD. It's okay if they have whatever other credential. You want to request letters from people who can speak to your skills, achievements, and promise. So you don't want to get letters from family, your personal therapist, or a teacher who you got an A in their class and you showed up on time and that's it. because these people don't know enough about you or the family and personal therapist or close friend or whatever. They have a biased opinion of you. People are not going to trust them because they obviously want you to succeed. They don't have that third person perspective that's necessary to write a letter. So you want to have people write you letters who can speak to your skills. They've seen your academic, research, clinical, interpersonal, professional skills at play that are relevant to the program you're applying for. So if someone hasn't seen that aspect of you, you don't ask them for a letter because they're not going to be able to speak to those qualities that actually matter for success in graduate school. And that's why you need to be grooming these letter writers early and identifying people who can speak to these skills, achievements, and promise, and doing work and research assistantships and helping internships in these places where you can demonstrate these skills and achievements so that people can talk about them in a letter they might write you. When you provide materials to them, you're not just saying, hey, can you write a letter, give it to me in a few weeks. You're providing, if they say, yes, I can write you a letter, then you're providing them with a packet of materials. What is in that packet? And usually you're sending it to them electronically, unless they ask for otherwise. Usually you give them a copy of your personal statement. You don't have to give them all your personal statements for all the programs, but just a representative one so they can get a sense. Give them the finalized copy of your CV, and then give them a spreadsheet that's kind of like the spreadsheet you built for yourself to keep track of programs, but it's more concise. It's got key info. So it's got things like the due date for their letter for each program, how the letter is going to be submitted so that they know the protocol. Are they going to be emailed by the institution? Do they have to email it to an email address? Do they have to postal mail it? The name of the institution, the name of the department within that institution, the type of degree you're hoping to get into, the profession or specialty, a website link to that program's homepage so they can check it out if they want. Does the program emphasize science, practice, or both? Are there any particular aspects of your professional self that you're hoping your letter writer might be able to speak to in terms of, like, you might hope this letter writer can really be talking about your research skills, your clinical acumen, or whatever it is. You can't force, you can't demand that a letter writer talk about certain aspects of yourself, but you can remind them of aspects of your work with them. And some letter writers, I know I do this, for example, that when someone requests a letter from me, I have them fill out some paperwork where they talk about the skills they believe they demonstrated, the qualities they believe they demonstrated in their time in my research lab or in my class or whatever the context is, so that I can consider that and I might choose to incorporate that. So you can provide stuff to them with the understanding that they may or may not end up incorporating it into their letter. But by providing that information, you can make their job easier. And that's the big overarching thing. Smooth the process as much as possible for them. And that relates to the last bullet point, which I'll skip over to briefly. Make it easy. And so that includes, providing the materials they want and keeping everything organized. If you have to paper mail stuff, provide them with pre-stamped, pre-addressed envelopes. Don't ask me to find envelopes and stamp them and all that silly work. Do that yourself. Okay? Make it as easy on your letter writers as possible. Otherwise, you might communicate in lack of professionalism and conscientiousness. And if there are forms, if there's like a letter of recommendation, cover letter with ratings and other key information, fill out the parts you can complete. Fill out the parts that are okay for you to fill out in terms of like addresses and email addresses and all that stuff that you can find on the professor's website so that they can concentrate on just doing the ratings and uploading their letter or whatever it is. So that's what I mean by completing boilerplate. So do whatever stuff, fill out whatever stuff you can fill out so they don't have to do the silly stuff. I alluded to the fact that you want a strong letter, not just a letter. So a lukewarm letter is a kiss of death. A letter that says, yeah, they were okay, they were fine, it is code for this student is not good graduate student material. Okay, because letter writers are sensitive to the fact that someone, including the applicant, may read their letter even if they're not supposed to, potentially in the future. It may not remain confidential like it's supposed to be. And so we don't want to say anything that could get us sued. We have to be diplomatic in what we say. And so usually when we are not satisfied or we have reservations about a person, we'll give lukewarm accolades. We won't say they were bad at X, Y, and Z. That's generally not how we do it. So having this lukewarm letter is not, a lukewarm letter is a bad thing. So you only want strong letters of recommendation. And so you can even reflect this in your response. When you're thinking about people you might want to have write your letters of rec, approach them and say, hey, Dr. Hammer, would you feel comfortable? Are you available, and would you feel comfortable writing me a strong letter of recommendation for my applications to PhD counseling psych programs? That's kind of how I'd word it. So you say strong letter because you just want strong letters. You want letters that are going to be talking about how good you are, not just that you are okay, because okay is code for bad. All right? Strong letter. And if there is an option to tick a box online or on the form or whatever, always, if there's a place where you can opt in or opt out to waiving your right to see the letter, you want to waive your right. Because if you don't waive your right, that means I can tear open this dude's letter from Dr. Hammer and see what he said about me. And if I know a student's going to be able to read what they said about me, I might be more circumspect. I might not be fully honest about my perspectives on this student. And so by waiving your right to see the letter, by making that explicit if there's a place to do that, because the default is that you're waiving the right, because usually they're soliciting the letter via email directly from the professor, so you never get a chance to see it. But if there's a place where you have to explicitly waive the right or not, do waive it, because then the letter writer knows that what they say will be confidential, so they feel more free to tell the whole truth. And professors at programs where you're applying to want to know that your letter writers felt fully honest and comfortable saying what they thought. Okay? They want to be transparent on that. So that's why you want to waive the right. Okay. Personal statement advice. Personal statements are tricky. It's the most painful part of the application. And usually for different programs of a similar type, you're going to be talking about similar things. A lot of your text is going to be very similar. There's going to be a lot of copying and pasting with some tweaking between your different personal statements. But it's extremely important that you customize to each program. So you can do some copy and paste, but then you got to customize. Cut some things out, add some things in, tweak them, because one of the big things, the criteria that people use to judge an applicant's fit with eligibility for a program is how well they fit. So are they talking about, are their goals in line with the training available at that program? Are they genuinely interested in a good fit to work with the professors in their given research area? Are they excited about the unique resources and opportunities that are present at this program, which may not be at others? So you need to customize it, because we want to see that this is not just a template copy and paste letter. Because if we see some generic thing that doesn't really, it's not tailored to University of Kentucky's counseling psych program, in my case, for example, then we'll just think you're, email blast applying everywhere. That you don't really care about us. You're not uniquely interested in us. You're just trying to get in somewhere. So you want to avoid communicating that. That's why you want to customize your personal statement to that program. Read extremely carefully their directions for the personal statement. If they ask you to talk about A, B, and C, talk about A, B, and C. Don't talk about E, F, and G. Okay, even if the last template you had talked about E, F, and G, don't. So give them exactly what they're wanting, because their prompts will differ. Some will ask about, give us an autobiography and your career goals and clinical experiences, and some will ask about social justice and cultural awareness expansion activities. So whatever they ask for, give them that. Very, very important, because when I read personal statements, I am laser focused on trying to find their responses to the specific prompts we ask for in our materials. So if you go on our counseling psych program webpage and then you go to apply, you can see the prompts that we list and what we're looking for. So give the people what they want. That's customizing. And I like when folks mimic the language. So if a prompt is, explain how your career goals are a good fit for the University of Kentucky training program, then I love to see a sentence where they say, University of Kentucky's training program is a good fit for my career goals because ... Does that make sense? So they basically, like when I'm reading through the essay, my eye gets caught on that key phrase and I can see their direct answer. So it makes it easier on me as a professor to find their answers. I don't want to have to search through the swamp to find the info I'm looking for. So when they mimic the question language and offer direct, concise responses, that's really nice. It makes my life easier and me more likely to want to invite them for an interview. Of course, good writing is essential. Be concise, not run on. Okay? And in terms of this question of how many pages should it be, it depends. Some programs give guidelines. If they tell you to do a thing, do it. If they don't, a good length is probably 2 to 3 pages double-spaced. Okay? If you need a rubric, 2 to 3 pages double-spaced is usually fine. But again, totally depends on the program. But that's a rule of thumb. Good writing means concise. There's good flow. Sometimes you can have section headers to answer different questions, in which case it doesn't have to be, that typical 5-paragraph essay. It's more important that you answer the questions. That's the most important thing. And absolutely avoid any errors, grammatical, syntactical, whatever. If we see one error, that suggests, hey, this person, for whatever reason, couldn't take the time to proofread the most important introduction and first impression to us. They somehow couldn't muster the energy or the ability to make sure that their work was spotless in this one short thing that they give us that speaks to their quality as a professional, that there's an error in it. So it's just not acceptable to have. So you proofread it, get your family to proofread it, get other people to look at it, catch any and all errors, because that can be a silly and easy way to throw an applicant out of the running, is because they let errors in. And so if you're going to make errors in this most important document, what else are you going to mess up when you get here? That's kind of the implicit message. So absolutely avoid errors. You're trying to communicate some personal attributes: maturity, drive, vision, humility, awareness, like we talked about, semi-autonomy. What I mean by that is that next bullet point. So you want to communicate the overall philosophy, the stance from which you're framing your personal statement, is you want to let them know, hey, I've got a solid foundation in research and clinical work and blah, blah, blah. I've got the solid foundation in the skill areas and attributes that you say you want in an applicant, and I'm so excited to grow and learn more and develop, because I know while I have a decent foundation, I've got so much to learn. I've got so much to learn over these 2 to 6 years. I'm so excited for it. That's the right frame we want, because this is a training program. This is not a job where you're expected to come in and do the thing perfectly because you have the competency. No, you're going to be trained to do this stuff. So we want good raw material. We want you to have a foundation so that we can shape you and mold you like clay into something awesome. So we want you to be moldable and excited for that process. So you're trying to capture that seeming contradiction, that you have a solid foundation, but you're not so solid that you think you're hot stuff and you've got it all figured out. No, you're humble, you're wanting to grow. And this relates to drive and vision. We want to see that you have the drive and the work ethic. We want to see that you have the vision, especially if you're we want to see that you have clearish career goals. You have a sense of where you might want to head. And if you're applying to a PhD program, we want to see that you have a clear interest in a given topical area. Not too narrowly focused and not too widely focused, but that you have bona fide interest in an area and you have a vision for how you could, what stuff you've really liked about their work and how you're hoping to help work with them on things, and maybe some tentative ideas you have about parts of their program of research that you could help work with them on developing, independent study ideas you have, so you have some vision. And that's for that semi-autonomy piece. Yeah, I think we covered that well enough. So the match with two professors. You generally, and if we're talking about match with professors, this is relevant to PhD programs only, usually, because they got that research component, that apprenticeship component that we talked about, right? So it's about fit. So you're applying to PhD programs to work with specific professors who share areas of research that overlap with your areas of interest. And so you need to sell them on that. So you need to talk about how if this professor, if someone's interested in my work in help seeking, this applicant needs to talk about how hopefully they've done some work in the area and how they have a genuine interest in it, and show that they've thought a little bit about it, that they've read some of my work, that they have some tentative ideas for cool new angles we could take to that research. We want to see that bona fide match. And you want to do it not just for one professor in that program, but you want to reasonably sell yourself as being a potentially good fit with two professors. If you go three or more, sometimes it becomes less believable because we think you're just saying, oh, I could match everybody. It would be great. Everybody could work, which is not realistic. So I think the magic number is 2. But again, ask your other mentors and consult other sources on this because, again, this is just my opinion, but I think in your personal statement, you want to talk about how you could be a great fit for 2 of the professors. Even if you're truly only mostly interested in one professor, you need to at least make a reasonable case for how you could be a fit for both that person and at least one other person, in my opinion. In your personal statement, in terms of that showing that fit, you're giving at least 3 to 5 reasons why this program is a good fit. So you're talking about special features like unique sub-programs or seminae or foci of the program and how they would really help you get a competency or a skill set you need, particular kinds of training or practicum sites that are available that are a good fit with your goals and interests, the opportunity to work with a specific professor on shared research interest area, we just talked about that, program quality outcomes that are unique and desirable to you. So what do people going through this program, what does it set them up to do, and how's that tied to your goals, and how's that maybe unique to this program versus some others. So you're picking out any unique tidbits that you learn from professors, read carefully their website and figure out what's unique and interesting, what's their philosophy of their program, what sets them apart from a lot of the other programs, and talk about how that's a really great fit for your interests and skills and your career goals. Okay. Some kisses of death related to the personal statement. Discussing personal mental health problems. So I was actually guilty of this in my essay. My first sentence was like, given my experiences with depression when I was in high school, blah, blah, blah. It ended up being okay because I was otherwise pretty mature and professional and not oversharey. But it's a dicey thing. Of course, a lot of us are interested in psych because we've had some mental health stuff in our lives, whether our own or our family members or whatever. Like, we get that. But you don't want your essay to be focused on your personal mental health problems, your issues, your history. So it may be okay to have a brief mention, but you don't want to communicate the idea that you're still suffering from it, or that it's messed you up, or that it takes up a lot of your energy, or it's a big focus, because that stuff is going to get people worried. Even if that's a real part of life for a lot of us, you might worry your professors and the people at that program into thinking do they have this mental health issue under control enough so that they can do good work in graduate school? Are they ready for this? Because graduate school is tough. So you want to communicate that you are mentally sound and ready to do this high-level rigorous work for many years, and talking about your personal mental health problems can compromise that. So again, read the Insider's Guide and Graduate Studying Psychology for other opinions on this, but be very, very careful about mentioning that. There's plenty of other stuff to talk about. Your essay doesn't have to incorporate that. Avoid these kind of general self-accolades. I want to help people. People always came to me for advice. I was the friend they came to. These kind of general platitudes. Everybody feels this way. Every single applicant would say this about themselves. It's implied. We know that you want to help people, and that you were probably the person people came to it for advice if you're applying for a talk therapy program. You don't have to mention that. Talk about more advanced things. Talk about other more concrete things, not those general things. That doesn't feel like a compelling reason about why you should come to our program. Avoid excessive self-disclosure. So like painting yourself in a martyr sort of way, or say, I had to fight huge odds to do this, or I did this amazing thing, or whatever. So be careful about how you frame what you've done in your accomplishments. So you want to be humble. You don't want to be overly general. So be careful with self-disclosure stuff. And if you look at Appleby and Appleby's paper that you can Google for Google Kisses of Death, they talk more in depth about these personal statement kisses of death, so you can read it from the source directly, and I would encourage it. Avoid professionally inappropriate disclosures, being overly informal, too humorous, overly clever, or overly religious tones. These are all things that can have us question your professionalism, because this is a professional document where you're communicating maturity and even-handedness, and these things can run afoul of that, so be very careful. A lot of times people talk about in this very meandering way at the start of their autobiographical part of their essay about, like, here's how I became interested in psych. In grade school this, and in high school this, and they've spent a paragraph or two building up to the point where they're here now applying to graduate school. And it's like, it's usually not that essential. That's not what we want to know. We want to know more about your skill sets, which are related to your past experiences. We want to know about your skill sets and experiences, your goals going forward, and how the program you think fits with that, and will help deliver those things. So we don't want this meandering origin story for you. We don't want you regurgitating your CV either. We can read your CV, so don't just copy and paste and said, in this lab I did task A and task B and task D. In this other lab I did, we can read that in the bullet points in your CV. Your personal statement is where it's a more narrative form. You talk about some of those fuzzier, overarching themes and things that may be alluded to in your CV, but this is where you put it all together in a cohesive narrative. The CV is listing out the brunt facts of, I had this, I did experience with this, got involved in this project, did this task for them. That's what your CV is for. Don't just regurgitate that in your personal statement. It's got to be more narrative. And be cautious about talking about why the program fits because of things that are unrelated to the program, like, I want to go to UK because I got family in Lexington, and boy, that would be convenient. Like, that's fine, and that's great when it happens to work out, but don't tell us that. That shouldn't be the reason you're applying here. We want you to be applying here for us, for our program, and what it offers you professionally, not because it's nice for other aspects of your life, or you really like the city, or whatever it is. So avoid that stuff. And if you're applying for a PhD program, which is that scientist practitioner model, then you don't tell us, I'm not really that interested in research. I'm mostly interested in clinical work. The PhD is designed for people who are interested in both. So if you're not interested in both, you should go do a PsyD or a master's or something else. So you want to be very mindful of, because that's a lack of fit. If you're not interested in research, we're not going to want to take you on, because that's half of what we do in a PhD program. The big truth, and I don't know why I shouldn't say personal statement, big truth. I should say references, big truth, the letter of big truth. So your advanced plan and conduct and performance dictate the quality of your letters. So when it comes to how strong of letters you're going to get, this is going to be dictated by what you did for them and how you comported yourself with them. So it's super important to remember that whether you get a strong letter or not is mostly up to you. Did you get involved in research labs? Did you get involved in those applied experiences? And did you do good professional work there? Did you comport yourself, or were you on time, and were you respectful in oral and written communication? So all of that stuff which we can sometimes get a little lazy about, kind of that professionalism, skimping on that means that you can deliver a less good impression to that letter writer, and then they're not going to be willing to say things about you they don't believe are true. So if you want them to say like they're an amazing scholar and they're a really great person, then you got to be an amazing scholar and demonstrate that you're a good person and how you behave and perform. So I see way too many people involved in research and RA experiences and stuff where they give it half effort, and they're not always communicative, and sometimes they don't show up, and they're late on their deadlines for projects and stuff like that. You're killing your letter of rec. You're just killing it. So you want to be your professional top self throughout your undergraduate training, because that's what will earn you the letter, because you basically write your own letter. So there's that. Back to the CV now. My advice around the CV is that you want to find some good templates online, preferably from successful graduate students in your program, because usually their CVs will have a formatting more suitable to where you're at, rather than the professors who have a lot more different types of experience, and so their format of CV may not be as a good help. But get a bunch of good CVs from people you trust, who you would think have good CVs, and sometimes you can download them off of Google and stuff, and then adopt one of those templates you think is going to work well for you, and then customize it with your info. Okay, we do that all the time. I got Lisa Spannerman's CV, gazillion years ago, and it's the format I've used ever since, and from a student and now into a professor. And the CV style should be clean and consistent formatting with some white space present, not crammed full of stuff, because it needs to be visually pleasing and consistent formatting. I see way too many like, oh, this is bolded and then this similar thing is underlined later. Use a consistent formatting, and generally use bold. Underline can be okay, but it can look a little ugly, and italicizing can not always look okay. So usually bold is good, but you'll see examples. Only create a new section for your CV when you have several bullet points that could go under that. Don't have, unless it's a poster presentation or a manuscript authorship, in which case even if you only have one, you could have a separate section because that's important. Like when it comes to your service and volunteering and stuff, don't split it up so that each summary has only like 1 or 2 bullet points. You want ideally like 3+ for it to look substantive. So you can combine similar sections into an overarching thing. Avoid polarizing information. So politics is misspelled there. Guess I'm not getting into the PhD program. So avoid polarizing information. So don't list stuff about like religious involvements or political involvements or other potentially radical things that may communicate the wrong impression. So sometimes you're involved in religious things that are also helping stuff, so sometimes you have to make a judgment call about what to include or what not, or how to word it. Wording it one way versus wording it another can communicate a professionalism. So we worry about someone who might not be open and objective in how they approach graduate school, and so polarizing information can get us nervous. Lastly, research experience sections should communicate what tasks or skills you had the chance to learn or demonstrate. Just don't say, oh, I was involved in X lab. Like, I want to know what skills or competencies you learned and had the chance to practice, because I want to know what stuff you have exposure to, because that judges how strong of an applicant you would be. When you keep it vague and you just say you were an RA, I have no idea if you were just entering data into SPSS from Microsoft Excel the whole time, just entering data like that versus doing lit reviews or other more substantive things. I really want to know. So it's really important to be clear about what you did and did not do as a part of that experience. Interview advice. Okay, so if you submitted good materials and you got a few interviews, what are some things to keep in mind? Those ones in blue: know your career goals, articulate fit with program, research interest, solid foundation. All that stuff we already talked about when it came to the personal statement. So that stuff all remains true. You're just doing it in person with the interview. But what else is new? Be on time wearing business professional, not business casual, but business professional attire, typically a suit. Important, because first impressions go a long way. A firm handshake, a smile, and general positivity. You want to be upbeat and positive. Don't be negative. Don't complain about people. Talk about what you're excited about and your positivity, and be even-handed. Don't criticize people. It's just when you're positive, when you bring that positivity, we like to see that. If you're bringing negativity and pessimism, that's a turnoff. Relationships, not competence. And I should mention too that I did a whole video on interview advice that's on my website, so check that out. I go into these in much more detail, so I'm not going to belabor them too much here. But yeah, with this relationships, not competence, if you're invited for an interview, that generally means that your materials showed them that you're competent enough, you're smart enough to do this work. The interview is mostly about how are you as a person? Do you have interpersonal skills? Are you a team player? Are you a reasonable human being? That's what the interview is mostly designed to get at. Plus maybe a little bit of competence too. But what I got into trouble with when I was applying to programs is I was so obsessed with trying to show people how smart I was that people weren't sure if I seemed too task-oriented. I didn't seem like a team player. I didn't seem like I was focused enough on relationships. And this may matter more or less depending on the specialty you're going into. Some people may be less focused on how interpersonally polished you are, but specialties like counseling psych really care about it. So you want to be focused on building relationships with the people here, relating to them well, giving them a positive impression, asking questions about them, getting to know them, kind of communicating that right tone in how you interact with them. So, focus on being relational and relatable with folks. Don't get so caught up in trying to show them how smart you are. That will come out naturally. So focus on that relationships piece. Honor that. You're going to feel anxious. That's okay. You can have that anxiety. Just find ways to manage it well so it doesn't overwhelm you and leak out all over the place. So we know applicants are going to be nervous. Interviewees are, of course, going to be nervous. But if you're way too nervous and shaking and just all over the place, that's going to be a problem because we're going to need you to be able to perform in pressure environments like this. And so if it's clear that you are not good at managing your anxiety, that's a problem. But everybody's going to have some degree of anxiety because it's an evaluation context in an interview. That's normal. Remember that you're always being watched. So the admin specialist, the graduate students, the night before, the person who picks you up from the airport, people are always taking mental notes on how you are. It's not just when you're wearing your suit and you're there during interview day itself. So always be on your best behavior. Otherwise, they will question your interpersonal abilities and your genuineness. Awareness, we talked a little bit about this. You want to demonstrate interpersonal awareness, emotional awareness, awareness of your nonverbals. So you don't want to be doing annoying stuff with your hands or whatever. Cultural awareness, especially in counseling psych. So demonstrating a degree of awareness is important because if you're doing things where people are like, why are they doing that? Don't they know that that's kind of a turnoff, that it makes people not like them, that it annoys people? They're not going to want to see that. Don't ask questions that you could have gotten answered from the website. Otherwise, it looks like you didn't do your homework. Instead, ask questions that you can only really get answered in person, that are unique, that are nuanced, that show that you've done some homework and you have a follow-up question. So have sound questions that show that you're genuinely interested, critically thinking about the fit of the program, that sort of stuff. That's what I mean by non-Googleable. The answer can't be found just by doing an internet search. Social media self-audit. Make sure, if people are probably going to Google you as an applicant, make sure what they can find in terms of pictures and stuff you say and tweet and whatever is not going to embarrass you or make you look like someone who's not suitably professional and mature. Okay. Videotape and review responses. Practice talking about your career goals, how your past experiences and how they make you a good fit for the program, and just your fit with the program. So practice giving those responses to a video camera that's taping you, and then go watch that video and see if you're doing weird nonverbal things, see if your tone of voice, your eye contact, see if your answers are good. You want to practice it at least once. Believe me, it is so worth it to do that. It's so worth it to do that. Because you will catch yourself doing funky things that would create a bad interpersonal impression, and you can tweak that to up your game. So at some interview places, you do behavior-based interviewing where they ask you about a specific situation, like tell us about a time where you had a conflict with a supervisor and how you managed it. That's called behavioral-based interviewing. It's a good idea to do. When you answer these questions, remember the 3 S's: situation, skills, and success. Describe the situation of that type that you were in. Talk about the skills you demonstrated or used to work in that situation, and then talk about how that led to success, how that led to good outcomes. Even if it was a tricky, conflictual situation, talk about how you ended up making progress or resolving the thing or managing it well. And again, that's a great thing to videotape and then review. And there's plenty of online resources about like good interviewing skills generally, not just interviewing skills for like psych programs specifically. Read up on it. A lot of the advice is good regardless of interview setting. So behavior-based interviews, be prepared for that. And then lastly, send a thank you email to key people. So for this, people who you had a substantial conversation with, certainly people who you sat down in their office, like a professor you sat down in their office with and had a conversation. So those key people you met and had a substantive interaction with, I do recommend sending a brief email. The Insider's Guide has template emails that you can think about adapting. You can probably find some examples online, but short and sweet, where you talk about how you appreciated their interaction, how you're excited about the program, hopeful for being offered admission or whatever it is. So you're communicating your thankfulness for the time they took to interact with you and your excitement about the potential of being able to join them in the program. So thank you emails are a nice touch. So that is the conclusion of our 2-hour webinar on how to apply to Psychology Graduate School. I want to remind you about some of the great resources I have on my website, drjosephhammer.com. Be sure to check out the Resources for Students tab. I've got the Systematic Career Exploration approach, which for you, a friend, a family member who's not sure about what they want to do for their career and what educational path to take, this is a great resource for exploring that. For those of you interested in one of the mental health professions, the Mental Health Profession Career Test can help you figure out which of 21 different mental health professions may be a good fit for your interests. So it can help give you a sense of direction. How to get into a counseling psychology PhD program YouTube video series. This is a 10-part video series. It's got additional videos I've added beyond these here, and it is a comprehensive look at everything you need to know about getting into a counseling psychology PhD program in particular. And it's many hours, very in-depth, everything I've learned about the process. So if you're interested in counseling psych, and a lot of it's applicable to clinical psych and other areas, that's a great resource if you can set aside the time to listen to it. Graduate school advice, this is a catch-all page where I provide a number of different pieces of information. I link to videos of mine on topics about how to interview well or how to find the right research lab. Also written information. So for example, if we go back here and what the ideal graduate school applicant looks like, here's where I flesh out in much more detail what the ideal doctoral applicant looks like, at least as it comes to counseling psychology PhD program. So this goes into more detail than I was able to in the presentation you just watched, so check that out. I also provide a list of master's programs in counseling psych and counseling that tend to have good reputations and you might consider. So there's a link to each of the programs down here through hyperlinks, and you can see on the Google map where they are at in the country if you prefer to check them out that way. So that can be a handy resource if you're thinking about a master's degree, perhaps on the way to a PhD. And then I also provide a list of helpful statistics, SPSS, and M+ tutorial videos that I've collated from across the internet and YouTube that a lot of people have found helpful. If you're a current University of Kentucky student, and you're looking to get some applied, helping, clinical-ish experience, the UKSci $3.99 internship opportunity with me in the department is a great opportunity where you get a chance to be a part of a training environment where graduate students are learning how to do those core therapy skills, and you as interns will work with me to help them practice those skills. So you'll get exposure to what that environment is look like and see what it means to do good therapy. And then if you're thinking about becoming a psychologist in the state of Kentucky, this is my comprehensive applying for psychologist licensure in Kentucky page. If you are interested in getting research experience in a research lab, check out the Hammer Lab page, and particularly the prospective undergraduate RAs page, where I talk about how you can get involved in the lab, the advantages of being in my particular lab, and I have a video that goes into much more depth about how that work can look like, what you could expect if you become a part of the lab. So those are some of the main resources geared towards students that I want to encourage you to check out, and my YouTube channel grows every week with new videos on stuff related to success in graduate school and how to get into graduate school. So I hope you find some of this helpful, and if you appreciated the information in this video, I would appreciate if you'd consider liking the video and potentially subscribing to my channel and sharing this video with your friends or fellow students or fellow majors who you think might benefit from this information. So thank you so much.